Knowing this near universal pattern helps to assess new brands and existing ones.
What don't marketers know?
Quite a lot. Marketers largely live in an anything-goes world where the latest fashion or fad drives an awful lot of practice.
Segmentation is the recognition you can't serve everyone with equal satisfaction.
This is the Zac Anesbury Show.
Welcome. On today's podcast, we have Professor Rachel Kennedy. Now, Rachel is a Professor of Marketing at the University of South Australia and an Associate Director of Product Development at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute. Now, Rachel is a real special kind of academic in the way that she's able to create research that is very industry focused, but she still has that real scientific rigor. Rachel is also regarded as one of the top 1% of leading advertising researchers in the world, and you're going to hear about her journey from an undergraduate to industry, founding the Institute in Adelaide, expanding it to the Australian Eastern Board, and then finally making it global in London and New York to what the Institute is today. We also get some rather super cool insights into what it was like working with the late and great Andrew Ehrenberg, balancing her work and life, and ultimately what she wishes the marketing world would do. But without further ado, Professor Rachel Kennedy. Okay, so welcome to the podcast, Rachel. Thanks for coming in and sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Zac. Pleasure to be here.
So while I know you quite well, I mean, you were my honours supervisor and I've known you for, about 9 years now, I reckon. That might not be the case for some of our listeners. Did you want to give them a brief overview as to who you are and a bit of your background?
Absolutely. It's hard to know where to start, but I'll focus kind of on the marketing science part. I also did honours at UniSA, but I didn't go straight there. I was working in industry and I was at a hospital in a management training program, and that was going really well. I'd been headhunted there out of uni, but I realised that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I thought I would come back and get a master's and re-engineer my career to be in wine marketing.
Marketing?
Started down that route.
Okay.
And I was quite a long way into my 2 years master's by research degree, but I was living off $50 a week because there were no scholarships, there wasn't the infrastructure of the Institute today.
Wow.
And just realised that that wasn't a great situation to be in. Mm-hmm. And so with Byron, we found a new article that had just come out in the Journal of Advertising Research in the advertising area, and we thought it would be a very cool subject to replicate. So I changed from master's down to honours, and I did an honours thesis in 6 weeks, which is completely loopy, to change fields, to change degrees and collect data and submit. But I finished my honours. I had an examiner who refused by 1 mark to give me first class honours on theoretical grounds because he didn't like the perspective I had on how advertising worked. So the challenge there, that made me very angry. I kind of went, fair enough, fail me if my data collection is flawed, or I don't communicate, or I don't address my question. But don't fail me by 1 mark on philosophical grounds because you think the world is different to me, especially for honours. Yeah. But that anger was possibly a good thing because it drove me to do a PhD in advertising to put evidence behind my view, and or at least it took me down that route of doing a PhD in advertising.
So you did honours and then went straight to PhD after that?
I did indeed, in the advertising area. So that then became a key direction for my research following on. And in terms of finishing the question, while I was a research degree student, the Vice-Chancellor of the university sent an email to all university staff suggesting that academics should be engaging more with external stakeholders. And being in the business school, Byron and I went, yep, we should be doing more with the business community. So and some others who were around at that time. So we started going and knocking on doors to get involved in research projects with industry and we had some very tiny projects to start with, but we grew them over time and founded the Marketing Science Centre and then later the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute.
Wow, that's a hell of an introduction there, and there's so much to unpack there. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the few things that I picked up. So I actually didn't know you had a bit of an industry background beforehand. So did you want to run us through that a little bit?
Certainly. So as I said, I was headhunted when I left my undergraduate degree. I was heavily involved in ISEC, a business student organisation. And as part of that, I had an advisory board. One of the general managers there gave me an amazing offer for management training through Mutual Community. So that was the hospitals. So through there, I was given a number of different roles, from purchasing officer, HR, some marketing, so a broad experience. My favourite experience there was one Friday afternoon when he asked if I liked to shop, and I said, sure. So he asked if I would join him early Monday morning, and I went from, at that time, a personnel role into being the purchasing manager, because the rest of the purchasing department were walked off out of the building on the Friday afternoon, so I had to get my head around a completely new area. So that was a bit of a career challenge and some new insights. Another key industry experience I had was in Israel, where I was the international marketing manager for a high-tech computing company. So the owners of that business were straight out of the Israeli army, where they were working on major defence projects. And that they were given the right to commercialise some of the technology out of the Israeli army in return for having done extra time to finish off key defence projects. So my job was to help set up joint ventures and sell that expertise as quickly as possible around the world, because once people were aware of it, it would lose some of its value. So that gave me an amazing insight in terms of international marketing. That's been enormously useful since.
Wow, okay, so, and then you made the transition to academia, and what was your thinking in that, like moving from industry to academia?
So I was in the hospital setting, and I didn't want to continue down the health track, partly because my father's a doctor, my mother's a nurse, my brother's a doctor, godfather. I just thought I need to do something other than healthcare. They're all very caring, but it wasn't using my marketing skills. So thought I would transition and become a wine marketer was the thinking back then.
I had no idea a lot of people in your family were doctors in the medical field. Wow, that's interesting.
I'm the real doctor now, Zac.
That's actually a funny debate that we'll have after this podcast about who's the real doctor, in terms of whether it's people with PhDs or people who work in medicine.
I think both have value to give.
Seems like that's an argument you've had in your household as well.
Married to a doctor as well, so it might come up from time to time.
Have you heard the you're a fake doctor? Oh, you haven't?
Well, in the days of fake news, no one's been brave enough to say that to me yet.
I took it in jest, but then I had a look and I'm like, actually, PhDs were around, or using the doctor title, for about 3 centuries before medicine. So you're just a few hundred years late. Who's the fake doctor? Before that, I think it came from the church, actually. So I suppose we're all fake. Anyway, so you came to UniSA, and wine marketing, is that because of the influence of Larry at the time?
No, that was before Larry. I'm dating myself now, Zac.
Well, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
No, completely fine.
Who was that then?
Tony Sporton.
Oh, of course, Tony Sporton, yeah.
And partly it was because what were the opportunities within South Australia, and the wine opportunities were big, and a family background with winemakers, and so personal interest, I thought it would be a good thing. And some of the initial projects we got when we first started engaging with industry were wine related, so I could see the opportunity to explore that further. But once I started down the advertising route and we set up the institute, I realised, there were so many other opportunities. And in terms of history of the institute, we started jumping on planes because there were no head offices in Adelaide, in terms of getting exciting or interesting marketing research type projects. So lots of trips to Sydney and Melbourne to get to the Australian head offices. But we also relatively quickly realised that they didn't have budgets for research and often weren't making the big decisions about brands and advertising. So we started going on planes to London, New York and overseas. And so suddenly we realised the world is, a marketplace, and didn't need to just focus on what the strengths were in South Australia, but that could deal with, the biggest brands in the world. And that's the journey we've been on ever since.
I mean, I think it's a really cool story that I think everyone would actually like to hear. So, you sort of mentioned briefly that it was right in the early days. You had this email sent out by the Vice-Chancellor, let's try to become more engaged with industry. And it was literally going out and knocking on doors. In Adelaide? Is this how it all started?
Absolutely. I've still got the first report I ever wrote.
Really?
It was just focus groups.
Cool.
And, we literally started with nothing apart from brain power and our knowledge. And
who's we at this stage?
So Byron Sharp and myself in terms of people who are still here, and Sharp was heavily involved in teaching, but absolutely here and involved. Others who are not here now, but John Dawes came relatively quickly. Jenny, I think, was at Romanic a little bit after. Yeah. So some people who've come and stayed, others who were here and have left and done other things.
People who keep going and leaving and then coming back.
Yeah, definitely
like
those who've gone and come back.
Mel recently. Okay, so and then you realised, there's only a limited amount of opportunities with the wine industry in South Australia, and then smaller businesses in South Australia as well. And then you realised if we wanted to get bigger, we had to move to the eastern seaboard. So you and Byron started flying there.
Yeah, and others who were here. And over time, you can see we started with tiny projects where we'd be happy with a few $1,000s. And I remember we were so excited when we got the first $10,000 project dollar, and then, the first $100,000 project, and then the first $1 million project. So, over time, there's been this evolution.
Yeah.
Probably one key pivot point that's important in the journey is when I finished my PhD, I thought, it's time to let my wings fly, head overseas again, and, see the world. Byron, I'm very grateful, convinced me that maybe I should work while I was overseas rather than just taking off and seeing what happened. And so he wrote to a certain Andrew Ehrenberg and said, would he have an office space and be willing to involve me in some of the things that he was doing?
Was he at London Business School or South Bank at that point?
He was at South Bank at that point. Yeah. And there was another one of the researchers at that time who was here, a statistician, Cam Runke.
Oh, yes.
And he was also keen to go to London. So Byron said, there are two researchers, and so my salary, Byron, said, I'll pay the salary, but if you can, find some office space and work with these people, that would be wonderful. So it was meant to be a 6-month visit, not a very clear scope of work, but explore what work might happen. And that was an incredible time. So Andrew, I think, was very excited about having a statistician who could work with him for 6 months join his team. And I've heard from others he was far less excited about having a young female who he had no idea what he would do with. But he was a little too polite and didn't know how to say, yes, I'll have the statistician, but no, I won't have the young marketer.
Sure, Byron's bundled you in there.
So I was bundled in and accepted because he was too polite, much to Andrew's horror, I'm told by others. Anyway, we both arrived, and Andrew and I had an amazing time. The 6 months actually became many visits over a number of years where we did some great work together. So I taught him things that he didn't realise he wanted to know but that he loved. So, how to prepare decks and use a computer where he'd previously always had a secretary, but he realised he could manipulate data and do things in different ways. And he taught me so much about seeing patterns in data, pattern spotting across varied conditions, all the things that we know him for, but having that intense period working with him was an incredible opportunity.
Oh, one that I'm incredibly envious of, actually. I think it would have been amazing. So you arrived there and, Andrew's hesitant to host you, and how was your first...
I didn't know that, which is probably a good thing until I got to know everyone else there and they told me that. He was a perfect gentleman.
Yeah, so you kind of built up a very strong relationship quite quickly.
So the team that he had there was, amazing. So Gerald Goodhart, John Scriven, John Bown, others many of them had worked
us.
together for 50 years in different capacities, but probably the average age was about 70.
Yeah.
You know, something maybe more. And so, you know, I did stand out in terms of being female and so much younger, and I didn't have their stats and data focus but we found very quickly that there was a complementary skill set. So I was quite good at packaging the knowledge, and I probably had a lot of energy and enthusiasm that took projects to a new level. So the key thing I worked in that first 6-month period was the work on brand user profiles seldom differ. So Andrew had already secured the data and had an analyst working with him, but I took over kind of doing the number crunching and writing it up, and we bonded over that project. And we were lucky enough, you know, that was award-winning research, and then we moved on to the brand advertising as creative publicity paper and a number of other things. So, yeah, I wouldn't say it was bonding overnight, but we learnt to have a really good working relationship, loved working with him. You know, he took me to New York for the first time and introduced me to some of his contacts, which has been amazing, because then over time, many of those supporters who had stood by Andrew for a long time have now become core institute supporters, you know, these decades later. So it ended up being very much win-win for Andrew and the team at South Bank and all of the young researchers that became, you know, the institute, because there was beautiful synergy of being able to stand on their shoulders, because they'd done so much in marketing and had such a strength of applying science to this discipline, and yet we had an enthusiasm to go out and share that and to continue the work in different ways.
So, like, I know quite a bit about Andrew's work. I've probably read dozens of his articles and multiple times and quite embraced on it. But unfortunately, Andrew had passed away before I joined the Institute, so I never had an opportunity to meet him. How would you describe him as a person? You know, we all respect him for what he's done as work, but what was he like as a human being?
I really liked him. It definitely had a sense of humour, but you definitely could see his Germanic roots.
Okay.
And so he could be quite blunt and strong with some things, but I liked that. You knew where you stood. Probably wouldn't want to be on his wrong side, but there was a passion there. So if someone did, you know, critique work, he would spend hours and days or weeks, whatever was relevant, writing a response. And an amazing brain.
Yeah, that's what I've heard about him as well, from other people, like informally, it was a strong-willed person, and you know, really. Yeah, his intelligence was something that shone through his personal life as well.
Yeah, and an incredible passion to his work. I've never seen anybody else who would go through a manuscript so many times. Wow. Every word mattered. So English was his second language, but he was so particular about what word best described the data and best would communicate to others long term.
Yeah. That's actually a wonderful quality to have, especially because manuscripts are huge. You know, short manuscripts in marketing are, 4,000 to 6,000 words. The bigger ones are 12,000 words. And to sit there and literally scrutinise each word and then every sentence. I think the only person I've heard is like that is Keston Green, actually. I heard every single word, him and Scott Armstrong are very detailed, and, you know, because they don't want their work to be misinterpreted completely.
And the other thing about this is he was a statistician, so numbers were really his thing, but likewise he would spend enormous amount of times of thinking, how do you present data?
Yeah.
And that's where his principles of making sure things are sorted by market share so that you can see patterns that matter to brands, including totals or averages, were very much, you know, rules to him that should be the norm, and he wanted others to know about those so that we were all better communicators and get the most out of the data that we've got.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that the empirical things that he's found and the patterns in the data that he's found have changed the way we think about marketing. But I actually kind of feel like some of the stuff that's had a real impact that does go, unrecognized is the principles of data reduction. They are so huge because without applying them, things like removing unnecessary lines and the big one, which is ordering by size, if you don't do that, you just can't see the patterns.
And even things like rounding.
Yeah, rounding's a huge one as well.
Especially when people often, don't account for sampling error and then they make tables complex so you can't see the patterns. Yeah, very sensible rules.
And you see it in industry and academic conferences. You're sitting there and you're in a presentation, maybe the speaker has 15 minutes and they talk about previous studies and then they get along to their results. And you're sitting there and the way that they've presented this data, you can't possibly, within the 2 minutes of time that they give you to look at that slide, interpret what's going on. Because there's 3 or 4 decimal places, a lot of the time they're inconsistent and they're ordered in a funny way, or it's all grid line patterns. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm not sure I understand what you're trying to get across here. And so I'll try to listen into what they're saying, but I often... At a DC, actually, I spoke to a girl afterwards. I said, you should really read Andrew's work about principles of data reduction. It would very much help you. And then, funnily enough, I heard Robert East tell her the same thing after the presentation. So that thing, I think, has had a lot of impact.
I think it applies to industry equally. So a common thing is people get their tracking studies or whatever research report it might be, and their brand appears at the top of any reporting. And absolutely, they want to know where they stand.
Makes sense to them, yeah.
Well, it kind of in theory might, but then they don't realise that they're underperforming for their size because they're not sorted by size.
Yeah, it'd work if you had the brand that was the largest.
Absolutely.
Everything else. But I suppose
that's the minority of businesses, though, if we look at it statistically.
If you think from their perspective, though, and you don't realise that ordering by size is so important, that your perspective is my brand is the most important. So we'll make it easy for everyone else in the room, like our shareholders or other people in our team, maybe the finance team. We'll put ours at the top so then they can quickly find us. But like you said, it can lead to misinterpretation of the results.
But you can still do both. So you sort by share, but bold the brand of interest.
Yeah, I've done that for reports actually as well, in terms of just flagging the brand for who we're doing the report for. To be like, you guys are, 7th highest market share, but I'll put maybe their logo next to it or something. So then it is easy to find their brand for them, but they realise that they're not. Yeah. So
there's room to grow.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the paper that I knew you most for, especially entering into the Institute as an honours student, was the paper you mentioned just then, which was the brand user profiles seldom differ. I didn't realise that came out of your work with Andrew. I know he's one of the co-authors there. And so he already had all the data
So it was
there?
his idea.
Okay.
And he'd already worked out what the analysis might look like, because that was also building on other work that he'd done previously with Kathy Hammond and some others. Yeah. Yes, so that was my core project when I got to London, bringing that to life. And a key point was presenting it at the Market Research Society and, then getting it published. So.
Yeah, I think it's, I quite like the paper. I've read it so many times and since I've replicated it with you, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I remember actually when Robert East and Kathy Hammond were visiting the Institute. Now, this must have been, we were still in draft stage of that paper at this point, so it must have been 4 or 5 years ago now. And I was sitting with Kathy in the lunchroom, and she has no idea who I am. I was just a master's student at the time, I think, and here I am telling her, I really liked her paper from 1996, and she's just looking at me like, yeah, cool, that's lovely, and then so I start talking to her, and she tells me that about how she used to actually go about analysing this data, that there were these big wheels of data that were on film, and you'd have to book time at the one computer that the university had, and you'd hand over your film and your analysis, computer inputs to someone, and they would run it overnight. And if you made one small error in your code, well, then it didn't turn out properly the next morning, and then you had to redo it. And it made me think just how grateful I am that everything's on the computer, and you have to pay attention because you can make errors, but we can manipulate data like this now.
And we've got access to literature at the click of a finger as well.
That's true, yeah.
So that was one thing when I was working with Andrew. I would go online to the library to get the latest literature in the field, whereas to him that was quite new. You had the hard copy of the journals that you read, or you went to the library and might request copies from other journals. So, you know, I was a completely different world in terms of, you know, just having Excel and access to libraries online. And so that's where I could add value to the partnership, because I could speed up some things, but he just had that incredible curiosity and the thought of how to tackle these problems and so much else that made it a huge honour for me.
I can only imagine how, I don't know, having giant stacks of physical copies of journals and needing to use that as your database of how to write stuff.
And to keep track of it all.
Yeah, no referencing software.
Absolutely. And
all the things we take for granted. I think there's actually room to move in that referencing software, but we'll see. That's
another project for you when you've done enough podcasts.
Yeah, this is pretty fun so far, actually. I quite like it. Okay, so your work for the brand user profiles paper was a replication of Kathy's work. I view replication extension research as fundamental to the way science should be done and how we progress.
You're good Ehrenbergian.
Very good Ehrenbergian. But, you know, rather than people listening to me, did you want to perhaps give your view on the importance of replication and extension research?
It's a fundamental pillar of science, and that's where we are standing on these shoulders of the likes of Andrew Ehrenberg and Gerald Goodhart, of that fundamental pattern spotting of, do we see the same things time and time again, and or where do they vary? And you can only systematically do that if you keep collecting data the same way, or the same way with slight extensions, so that you can see how the world works. And so, yeah, huge fan of the importance of replicating time and time again, so different researchers have confidence that they find the same thing, that you see the same thing if you use slightly different measurement tools, or if you don't, starting to understand why. Have you actually found something that's different, or have you made a mistake and your tool's dodgy, or whatever it might be?
Yeah. And so most of the time what comes to mind for me when I think about it is having that confidence that this knowledge has been found in so many different circumstances by so many different people that are independent researchers, so they don't have an innate confirmation bias or anything like that. Different brands, different categories, different periods of time, so that you can go ahead and have pretty strong confidence that it's going to apply for your brand in your market. But I think the thing that I often don't think about, which is actually nice to be reminded, is when there are deviations to it, what does that actually tell you? Is there something wrong with the way you've measured it, or is there something genuine here? Was the brand only available for half of the year? Is it only supplied in half of the supermarkets? All sorts of things that could...
Yeah, and we do know lots of brands do deviate, and it's that then pulling the deviations together and going, okay, there is commonality. Store brands systematically do look different. Yeah. And once you understand when things deviate systematically, you can start to put theories and understand why. So in the store, brands being different, they have different distribution to national or international brands, and you start to get extra insight in terms of how the world's working.
Completely. So we were talking a little bit earlier about, you've moved from knocking on doors in Adelaide to, going to Melbourne or Sydney, then visiting London and New York, and more of those sort of head offices there. At what point did it become the Marketing Science Centre, and then at what point did it change to Ehrenberg-Bass Institute?
I should know the exact year and I could look it up easily, but it's not coming to mind. But I can tell you why it happened.
I think that's the way more interesting part anyway.
Exactly. So we were happily chugging along as the Marketing Science Centre, out there engaging with industry and, starting to do the same thing more often and getting better and better at it. And we got to a certain size, and the university kind of rewarded us by giving us institute status, which is far more prestigious kind of in the university, and came with some funding. So it's very nice on one level, but you can't be the Marketing Science Centre Institute, and we couldn't be the Marketing Science Institute because that was a different entity that already exists that was something different, so we needed to have a new name.
Yeah.
And at that point, we wanted to honour Andrew for his work of bringing, science to the discipline, and the fact that we were, continuing to build on his work as a core thing that we were doing, but also acknowledge Frank Bass on the other side of the Atlantic in terms of that, we're operating on the global stage, and, both of them did make significant contributions. And so, we became the marketing science. We went from the Marketing Science Centre to the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute.
Okay, so that's the reasoning behind it. I mean, I think it's a little bit more clear for me with Andrew, but a little bit less clear with Frank. But
there was still the pattern spotting of new launches. So, yes, we were absolutely less close to Frank Bass, but appreciated the contributions of, the development of knowledge to marketing that happened there.
Yeah. I think, I've seen some quotes of his before, and there's one on my desk, which is to do with, he also saw the value in generalizations and repeating science over and over again, because that's the only way you can have true sort of faith in it, to find these law-like patterns. So that does actually make a lot of sense. So we sort of joined your journey earlier on about, moving from undergrad to industry and everything like that. Did you always think you'd end up in marketing, or at any point? Did you think industry, or growing up as a kid, or?
I don't think I really knew as a kid what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Even in terms of studying business, I had a cousin who had studied business and thought, that seems all right, but I thought I'd probably do HR. But I had to put in uniforms, so I did that, and I hit Peru for a year. I thought, while I'm away for a year, I'll think and work out what I want to do.
That's awesome.
Only I was a bit too busy for that year and didn't really perhaps give it the thought that I should, so I came back and went, business it is. And I started that. But that first year marketing subject really did talk to me, so I decided to specialise in that area, and that has been a great thing for me.
Very, very cool. So you're noted as being in the global 1% of advertising researchers. Yeah, in that area, what sort of part of your research are you sort of most proud of? Do you have a particular manuscript that has a fond place in your heart?
Definitely the ones with Andrew, just because I learnt so much from him. They do stand out even to this day, but probably some of the others that I'm fond of are where I've had more of a role of crafting it and see that people are reading it and citing it, and that it's making future research better. So some of the ones with single source data, where we're trying to move measures from intermediate poor measures of advertising effectiveness to what are measures that actually predict how advertising works in the real world. So, which biometric measures are actually valid predictors of copy that sells. So the research around that area, I think, is the more recent work that I'm really excited by.
Yeah, you mostly publish in the Journal of Advertising Research, if people want to have a look at your work.
Absolutely. And that's been quite strategic in terms of I like work that actually gets used by industry.
Yeah.
In Journal of Advertising Research, well, partly because most of my research is advertising media related, is an obvious choice, but there are a number of advertising journals, but that one is interested in language that can be read and understood by practitioners, and that it's looking at practical problems. And so that fits with my own areas of interest.
It very much aligns with what the Institute wants to do as well, in terms of having that real-world engagement. I heard, it was at the last NSMAC actually, I heard Mark Uncles get up and talk about Journal of Advertising Research, and said, you really, and this is true for all journals, you really need to write for that audience of that journal. And he said, when you're writing for JAR, you really need to think, what are the people who, like the big companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever, what are the marketers, like the industry-based marketers in those organisations, what are they going to be interested in? And that's how he kind of framed it.
To me, I think it's what should they be interested in?
Yeah.
And often they are by the time the ideas are put to them, and many of them are.
Yeah. So you've spoken at a lot of the big global events, especially in the advertising field, like Canes and like Walk and stuff like that. Did you want to So I've never spoken at one of these big events. I've spoken at like conferences and stuff like that. Did you want to give us a bit of an insight as to what that is actually like and the benefits that you would receive from it, and I suppose the benefits you hope the audience gets from it as well?
So when you've got a really big event, you tend to have a very short amount of time.
Okay.
And so to me, well, one, the way to get there is to have good research that actually matters to people, which is what I want to be spending my time on anyway. But you'll get an invitation to the big stage if you've got something that's exciting to share that lots of people are interested in. Okay. So that's the first bit to get right. But then because you've got a short amount of time, it's being very clear on what is the story that you've got to sell or to share, and being able to package it in a way that can communicate it as efficiently as possible. And hopefully you can do it in a way that it's a bit fun and engaging as well. It doesn't have to be fun, but that you keep people's attention.
I think that last part's really important because they've probably seen lots of presenters over multiple days.
And conference rooms can be dark, and especially if you're talking about being, in the south of France where it's jam-packed agendas with parties at night. If you're then in a dark room with one presentation after the other, you can only get a certain amount of people's attention. So it's good to focus it on something that's actually going to make their life a bit better, that's going to make them spend their company's money more wisely or simplify what they're doing.
Yeah. What was your latest presentation about there?
Done a few there. I think the last one might have been in a session with Peter Fields of the Benet and Fields, or both of them, looking at, I think it was creative tactics that sell, something in that area. Okay. Or the latest one, that might have been the one before, might have been about targeting and segmentation. I do remember a slide about targeting is like salt. Too much of it and you ruin a dish.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I don't know if I could eat food without salt, really. But I agree.
A little bit of it is good, but too much not good for your heart there, Zac.
That's definitely true. So you travel quite a bit, and we're in a COVID world at the moment where we're all kind of grounded in Adelaide, which I'm particularly bummed about because I started to be sent places. But you have a husband and you have 2 young daughters, and you're a successful person. Do you have any tips about balancing all of that stuff, life and work, and not being here but still being present? I don't know, just general advice, I suppose, for that?
I don't know if I do it particularly well, but I just love being able to engage with people, who have marketing problems and who are interested in our research. So I just try and throw myself into that part when I'm with people overseas. And then when I'm here, I try and give my kids and husband as much of my attention as I can. Just, I try and live in the moment, and my calendar is just be all and everything. I schedule things and I do it when it's in my diary as best as possible, except some of the papers that I've got with you that get bumped a little bit.
It happens.
Lots of balls, and you just try and catch as many as you can.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of feel like, moving from PhD to like a postdoc role now and then supervising myself, I totally understand the incredible demands for your time. And then you have past students, and then you have to take on a new group, and you're like trying to finish off papers with them, but try to get these ideas up. It's many balls. And I don't have children and a husband to juggle. But when you say like living in the moment, I think, to me, like from an outsider perspective, that is how I do see you live your life. Like, I've seen you away in front of sponsors and conferences and stuff like that, and you're in there, like you're on top of your game. And then I see you on a Monday morning at the Monday morning meeting. I'm like, how's your weekend, Rach? And you're like, I did this, I did that. And it's like all of the time it's activities with your husband or your kids, like going to karate or whatever it happens to be. So that's probably a good way to go, actually. Because when they do get your time, they get all of your time.
I do try and live like that.
Yeah.
But this COVID time and actually slowing things down a little bit's not completely bad either.
Yeah, I'm on a lot of Zoom calls these days, which is, I think we'll all be a little bit sick of Zoom eventually, but it's a necessary evil.
I do think some good things will come out of it in terms of more engagements without always having to travel. I think the travel and the face-to-face is critical, but thinking about each different engagement and what's best and how to be as efficient is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely works for the new sponsors and introducing them to the Institute and stuff like that. I mean, I was using, I can't even remember what software, but there was all sorts of glitches where a couple of the times had to be cancelled because of software compatibility issues. And with the ramp up of like coding and software, of all of that stuff going on with Microsoft Teams and Zoom, and they're all flawless now and everyone's such an expert that I feel like that part of my job is going to be super easy now. Whereas we used to have 2 or 3 trial runs just for a 30-minute webinar. Like, we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, no, definitely far better. I wouldn't go flawless yet,
Yeah,
but
definitely not flawless
far
yet.
better.
So much better. I mean, was not a fan of Skype for Business, that's for sure.
Yeah, we won't name names, but some were clearly better than others.
So, I mean, the events that you mentioned, like Cairns and stuff like that, are very more industry focused, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Is there any academic conferences that you would recommend people go to that you've gotten something out of?
So EMAC and ANZMAC tend to be the key ones that many institute researchers go to, but there are a lot. So it depends on the specialist interests. Like if you're more interested in modelling and technical things, there are different audiences, conferences to. If it's more pure academic things like the ARF are probably more of a mix of the two.
Okay. Yeah.
So they're very practitioner focused, but they're interested also in academic work. So there's a bit of a merging of the two.
Okay, yeah. I would kind of, I mean, I don't know how many people from industry do go to ANZMAC, but I would see
No, that's
not
more.
too many.
No,
Okay.
very, very few.
Very few.
And those who do probably just because they're engaging with a particular academic on a project.
And they want to see their work being presented. That makes sense. And they have different tracks and different streams and everything like that. So I mean, every year I go there. It's now 500 people go to ANZMAC every year, which is quite a lot more than my first one, which was 8 years ago. I think it was like 300 people. And you go there and you see the same familiar faces. But I reckon I'd know 40 of them. And there's like, who are these other people and what are they doing with their lives? Like, they don't research in my area. They're like B2B researchers or something. You still see them every year, but I have no idea who they are. But I suppose they're kind of more general, whereas I have been told there's some benefit in, like, once you find sort of your research area, whether it's advertising or maybe a specialist sort of econometrics conference or whatever, then that's trying to go to a smaller conference it might be a better idea because there'll be less people and you'll be able to speak to the experts in that area.
Yeah, I was about to say that can be a big win of working out who else is going to conferences, and that's where I've had the most value. So I went to one in France, which I think was, under 100 people, but they were all advertising specialists. And so I got to meet some of the bigger names, and so it was much more intimate and focused. But yeah, there's a time and a place for different ones, depending where you are in your career, as to whether you're needing to build networks and meet people, or you just want to dive in and get, know what's happening in the domain.
Yeah, I guess it would be very, like, your individual circumstance. So if you're in a PhD position, for example, and you're a PhD student and you're thinking, I'm going to finish in 2 years, and there might not be capacity at your own university to hire you, or some universities have policies.
That's a big thing in the US.
Or they don't hire their own PhD graduates. I better network.
But also some conferences are very much tied into journals, and so it's a route to getting your work published. So editors will be there looking for work, and sometimes, the best paper in the stream can also be shortlisted to journals, or so if, getting published is a priority, then, that will help also highlight some conferences.
That's right. It was Jenny Romanik's work. She was presenting something. No, I was chatting to her before a presentation one time, and it was within the Institute. And I said, that was like a really cool paper. I finished reading it the other day. She got into the Journal of Business Research, which is an A journal, quite a good impact factor. And, she said the way that she got into it was the editor or someone specifically from the journal was there, liked her work and invited her to write for it. Right time, right place, and obviously great research.
Yeah, and certain conferences absolutely are set up to encourage that matching, because it's good for journals and editors that they can see what work is in progress and what fits with their journals. So they win out of the process because it can kind of speed up good matching, and good for the authors because, you know, they're sending their work to outlets that, you know, are likely to be interested.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Perfect. So I suppose a good way to end the podcast, so thank you for your time, Rachel, would be just if you have any general advice for any young marketers or maybe people from industry, what would be your key takeaway that you'd want for people to know?
I'm probably biased there, but I'd encourage them to read and get to know how brands grow and the evidence that has been built up over recent decades. You know, it might seem incredibly obvious to anyone listening to this podcast or who's aware of us, but I think around the world there are so many marketers who still are so focused on segmenting, targeting, positioning, you know, unique points of difference and some of these things that they're missing the big opportunity in marketing.
Perfect. And that book is definitely available on all of the, Amazon and Book Depository and all of those. Excellent way to finish. Thank you so much for your time, Rachel. I've learned so much. I've had a great time, actually.
Thank you, Zac. Always a pleasure to have a chat.
Bye.
Hey guys, it's Zac Anesbury here with just a couple of quick reminders. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, then make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. There are plenty more interviews to come with some of the world's leading marketing academics and practitioners. You do not want to miss these. In the meantime, if you're looking for another way to connect, then follow me on Twitter at Zac Anesbury. That is ZACANESBURY for my take on the marketing issues of the day.